17-year-old black teenager, arrested for a minor offense in 1993, vanished from inside a police station. The official story was that he assaulted an officer and escaped, becoming a fugitive. For 29 years, that lie was the only truth his family had. Then, a rookie officer, auditing a forgotten corner of the evidence room, found a sealed bag that should not have existed, and with it, the brutal, hidden story of the boy's final moments. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. In the struggling, predominantly black neighborhoods surrounding Atlanta's 4th Precinct, justice was a dangerous word. It was a weapon, not a principle, and the station house itself felt like an arsenal. On a sweltering July night in 1993, the air inside was thick with the hostility of the men who worked there, a tension that overshadowed the everyday smells of stale coffee and disinfectant. The man in charge of that arsenal was Sergeant Frank Miller, and he was looking for a target. Miller was a man built from hardened certainties and simmering resentment. In his late 30s, he carried himself with the swagger of a feudal lord, his precinct his personal fiefdom. He viewed the community he was sworn to serve with a mixture of contempt and suspicion, a perspective he openly shared with the younger, impressionable officers who fell under his command. His brand of policing was simple, brutal, and effective at maintaining a certain kind of order, an order built on fear. Into this fortress of prejudice, at shortly after 11 p.m., 2 of Miller's patrolmen brought 17-year-old Dion Campbell. Dion was not a hardened criminal. He was a smart, lanky teenager with a quick grin and hands that were more comfortable under the hood of a car than anywhere else. His dream was to finish his automotive tech program and one day open his own garage. He had a typical 17-year-old's rebellious streak, a tendency to question authority he deemed unfair, but he was a good kid from a good family, devoted to his mother and his 12-year-old sister, Nia. His crime that night was one of youthful poor judgment. He'd been a passenger in his friend's older brother's car when they were pulled over for a broken taillight. The car, it turned out, had been reported stolen earlier that day, a fact Dion and his friend were unaware of, a joyride gone terribly wrong. His friend, terrified, had tried to run. Dion, knowing better, had stayed put, his hands raised in surrender. He was brought into the precinct, uncuffed at the front desk, his eyes wide as he took in the grim, unwelcoming environment. Sergeant Miller swaggered out from a back office, a toothpick dancing in the corner of his mouth. He looked Dion up and down, a slow, appraising gaze filled with dismissive contempt. "What we got here, boys?" Miller drawled, not looking at Dion but at his officers. "Joyriders, Sarge. Found him in that Buick reported stolen off of Gantry Street. This one's Dion Campbell." Miller's eyes finally settled on Dion. "Campbell, huh? I know that name. You one of Curtis Campbell's boys? The one who runs that activist group, always crying about police reform." "He's my uncle," Dion said, his voice quiet but steady, refusing to be intimidated. A slow, ugly smile spread across Miller's face. "Is that right? An activist's nephew. Figures." He jerked his head toward the hallway. "Bring him to the back. We need to have a little chat." Dion's parents were called, told only that their son had been arrested in connection with a stolen vehicle and was being processed. His mother's panicked questions were met with bureaucratic stonewalling. They were told to wait for a call in the morning. His 12-year-old sister, Nia, listened from the top of the stairs, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't articulate, a fear born from the whispered stories she'd heard all her life about what happened to young black men inside precincts like this one. In a small, windowless interrogation room in the back of the station, the chat began. It wasn't an interview. It was an exercise in humiliation and dominance. Miller and 2 other officers, his loyal acolytes, circled Dion, who sat on a cold metal chair. The questions weren't about the car. They were about his uncle, about the people in his neighborhood, about his attitude. "Your uncle thinks we're the bad guys," Miller sneered, leaning close, his voice a low growl. "You think we're the bad guys, Campbell?" Dion, though terrified, refused to break. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his chin lifted. "I didn't know the car was stolen." That spark of defiance was all the provocation Miller needed. It was a challenge to his authority, to the order he enforced. The air in the room grew thick, charged with impending violence. Miller glanced at the other two officers, a silent, predatory communication passing between them. "You got a real smart mouth on you, kid," Miller said, his voice dropping the pretense of conversation. "Let's see if we can't teach you some respect." The door to the interrogation room clicked shut. The formal processing of Dion Campbell, the official record of his presence, was deliberately put on hold. He was now off the books, a ghost within the machine, alone in a concrete room with three men for whom his life, his rights, and his future were worth less than nothing. His last moments of freedom had ended not on the street, but right here, under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the 4th Precinct, the last place he would ever be seen alive. The interrogation room at the 4th Precinct was a place where the niceties of law and order were routinely suspended. For Sergeant Frank Miller, it was his personal domain, a concrete box where the frustrations of his shift and the venom of his prejudices could be freely expressed. When Dion Campbell, with the quiet defiance of a 17-year-old who knew he was being railroaded, refused to be cowed, he crossed an invisible line. In Miller's world, a young black man, especially the nephew of a known activist, did not have the right to look him in the eye and claim innocence. What began as intimidation escalated with terrifying speed. A shove, a sharp retort from Dion, a slap from Miller that cracked across the quiet room. Then the other two officers joined in. It was a chaotic, brutal flurry of fists and feet, fueled by ingrained racism and the pack mentality of men who believed their badges made them untouchable. Dion, wiry but strong from his auto mechanic work, tried to defend himself, to curl into a ball, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. The sounds were sickening, dull thuds against flesh, a strangled gasp, the scrape of the metal chair on the concrete floor. One of the younger officers, perhaps caught up in the frenzy or wanting to prove his mettle to Miller, grabbed a standard-issue police baton. The attack became even more savage. There was a final, sickening crack as the baton connected with Dion's skull, and then silence. Dion Campbell lay motionless on the floor. The adrenaline in the room evaporated, replaced by a sudden, cold wave of panic. Miller, his chest heaving, stared down at the unmoving teenager. He hadn't meant to kill him, not exactly. He had meant to teach him a lesson, to break his spirit, to assert his own dominance. But the rage had taken over, and now they had a body. A dead black teenager in their interrogation room. For a long moment, the three officers stood frozen, the gravity of their actions finally sinking in. Then, Miller's mind, honed by years of navigating the department's dark corners, began to work. There was no going back. There was only the cover-up. "Nobody saw him come back here," Miller snarled, his voice a harsh whisper. "The log is clean. As far as anyone knows, he was waiting in a holding cell up front." His eyes darted around the room, already constructing the new reality. He got violent, attacked an officer, made a run for it. You understand? The other two officers, their faces pale with shock, nodded dumbly. Miller was their sergeant, their shield. Their only way out was to follow his lead, to bury this deeper than it already was. The plan was cold, calculated, and executed with a chilling efficiency. They knew the precinct's blind spots, the protocols that could be bent and broken. First, they dealt with Dion. They wrapped his body in old evidence tarps from a storage closet. Late that night, during the quiet pre-dawn hours, they used a back entrance, one rarely monitored, to load his body into the trunk of Miller's personal vehicle. Miller then drove to a remote, abandoned industrial site on the city's outskirts, a place he knew from his patrol days, and disposed of Dion's body where he was certain it would never be found, perhaps in an old, flooded quarry or a sealed-off industrial furnace. Back at the station, they constructed the lie. Miller took the heavy police baton used in the final, fatal blow and struck his own arm, creating a deep, convincing bruise. He rumpled his uniform. The official story would be that Dion had suddenly become violent while being transferred to a holding cell, grabbed an officer's baton, struck Sergeant Miller, and then, in the ensuing chaos, bolted out a rear emergency exit, and escaped into the night. The final piece of the cover-up was the evidence. Dion's clothes, his jeans, his t-shirt, his sneakers, were now stained with his own blood. They couldn't just disappear. Miller, in a move of cold, arrogant cunning, decided to hide them in plain sight. He personally packaged the bloody clothes into a standard evidence bag. Along with them, he placed the tarnished police baton that had been used in the beating, an item that, if ever tested, would contain traces of both Dion's DNA and the officer's fingerprints. But he didn't log the bag. He didn't give a case number or a chain of custody form. Instead, he sealed it, scrawled a faded, illegible old case number from a long-closed burglary on the tag, and buried it in the back of a large, forgotten evidence locker in the station's sprawling, labyrinthine evidence room. A locker designated for unassigned items from closed cases, a dusty purgatory for lost and found property that was rarely, if ever, audited. He was hiding his crime in the heart of the very institution that was supposed to solve it. By morning, the official narrative was set in stone. An alert was issued for Dion Campbell. 17 years old, black male, considered armed and dangerous, wanted for assault on a police officer and escape from custody. He was no longer a victim. He was a fugitive. When Angela and Robert Campbell arrived at the precinct that morning, frantic for news, they were met not with sympathy, but with suspicion and hostility. They were told their son was a violent criminal who had attacked a decorated sergeant and was now on the run. The lie was delivered with such conviction, backed by Miller's injuries and the unified front of the officers on duty, that it was impenetrable. Their desperate pleas that Dion was not violent, that he would never do such a thing, were dismissed as the blind denial of distraught parents. The system had closed ranks, its blue wall of silence forming an unbreakable fortress around the truth. The search for a missing child was over. The hunt for a dangerous fugitive, a hunt designed to fail, had begun. The lie Sergeant Frank Miller and his cronies constructed on that violent night in 1993 did not just end the search for Dion Campbell. It poisoned his memory and condemned his family to a unique and excruciating form of public grief. They were not just the parents and sister of a missing boy. They were the family of a wanted fugitive, their sorrow tainted by a public narrative of shame and criminality. For 12-year-old Nia Campbell, the world fractured into a before and an after. Before, her older brother Dion was her protector, her hero, a laughing, vibrant presence who smelled of motor oil and promised to one day build her a custom go-kart. After, he was a ghost, a name whispered with suspicion, his smiling face on the missing posters they desperately printed replaced by a grainy, mugshot-style photo in a news report describing him as armed and dangerous. The official story, that Don, a nonviolent teenager, had suddenly assaulted a veteran sergeant and escaped into the night, never made sense to her, not even for a second. But her childish certainty was no match for the weight of an official police report. She watched the lie hollow out her parents. Her mother, once a pillar of community strength, became a quiet, fragile woman, defending her son's character to neighbors who now averted their gaze, her pleas for a real investigation dismissed as the delusions of a mother in denial. Her father retreated into a shell of grim, heartbroken silence, the injustice seeming to break his spirit. The strain, the shame, the unspoken accusation from the community and the outright hostility from the police department created a chasm between her parents that eventually became too wide to bridge. Their shared grief, unable to find a common language, pulled them apart. Nia grew up in the shadow of this injustice. In school, she endured the whispers, the sidelong glances from classmates whose parents had forbidden them from associating with the sister of a fugitive. She became fiercely protective of Dion's memory, her grief calcifying into a hard, cold anger. She saw firsthand how the system worked, how easily a narrative could be spun, how a black teenager's life could be so casually erased and redefined by those in power. That understanding became the defining force of her life. The Campbell family eventually moved away from the neighborhood, unable to bear the constant, painful reminders. The house was sold. but the ghost of Dion followed them. His case file, officially categorized as that of an escaped felon, was never actively investigated as a missing persons case again. It sat in an archive, not as a tragedy to be solved, but as a warning. Fueled by a burning need to fight the kind of systemic injustice that had destroyed her family, Nia excelled in school. She was driven, focused, relentless. She devoured books on law, on civil rights, on the history of policing in America. While other teenagers were at parties, Nia was at the library, studying. She knew she couldn't bring Dion back, but she could dedicate her life to fighting for others who found themselves caught in the gears of a broken system. She went to law school, her choice of profession a direct act of rebellion against the institution that had failed her brother. She became a public defender, a sharp, tenacious advocate for the marginalized, for the kids who reminded her so much of Dion. She was good at her job, respected for her fierce intelligence and her unwavering commitment. But every case she took on, every client she defended, was shadowed by the one case she could never litigate: her brother's. By 2022, Nia Campbell was 41 years old. She was a respected, formidable attorney. Her parents had passed away years earlier, their health, she believed, eroded by decades of unresolved sorrow. She was the sole keeper of Dion's true story. The official narrative still stood: Dion Campbell, fugitive. But for Nia, he was, and always would be, a 17-year-old boy who had walked into a police station and never walked out. The blue wall of silence that had protected Sergeant Frank Miller, who had since retired with a full pension and a reputation as a tough-as-nails cop from the old school, had held firm for 29 years. The other officers involved that night had either retired or transferred, their secret buried under decades of carefully maintained official records. The case seemed permanently sealed, the truth a ghost that only Nia could still see. She had tried over the years to get the case reopened, approaching new police chiefs, talking to investigative journalists. But without new evidence, her claims were seen as the lingering, biased grief of a loving sister, unable to accept the facts. The official story was too solid, too long established. The file remained closed. Nia had almost resigned herself to the fact that she might go to her grave with the truth a burning and proven certainty in her heart. She had fought her battles in the courtroom for others, a proxy war against the injustice that had claimed her own family. She didn't know that miles away, in the dusty, forgotten labyrinth of the 4th Precinct's old evidence room, a young, by-the-book officer was about to begin an audit that would finally, after 29 years, pull the single, loose thread that would unravel it all. In the sprawling, climate-controlled labyrinth of the Atlanta Police Department's Central Evidence Facility, time moved differently. Decades were measured in the fading ink of evidence tags and the slow accumulation of dust on forgotten shelves. In the autumn of 2022, this stagnant world was disturbed by a city-mandated initiative, a full, comprehensive audit and inventory of all long-term evidence from the city's older precincts before a planned consolidation into a new, modernized facility. It was a monumental, tedious task, largely assigned to younger, junior officers. One of these officers was Ben Carter. At 26, he was everything Frank Miller, in his prime, had not been: meticulous, idealistic, and a firm believer in procedure. Carter saw the chain of custody not as a bureaucratic nuisance, but as a sacred trust. His job was to account for every sealed bag, every logged weapon, every piece of a life's tragedy stored in these quiet, climate-controlled rooms. He was assigned to the section containing overflow evidence from the old 4th Precinct, a corner of the warehouse that hadn't been properly audited in years. The shelves were packed with sealed cardboard boxes, their contents described in faded, handwritten scrawls from the 80s and 90s. For weeks, his work was a mind-numbing routine of cross-referencing logbooks with physical items, his scanner beeping rhythmically in the quiet. It was on a slow Tuesday afternoon that he found the anomaly. Tucked away at the very back of a high shelf, behind a stack of boxes containing evidence from a long-closed 1980s drug bust, was a large, sealed evidence locker that bore no proper markings. Most lockers had clear, stenciled numbers corresponding to a master log. This one was blank, its metal face scarred and dented. Its lock, however, was a heavy-duty, older model, still firmly in place. It wasn't on his inventory sheet. According to the official records, this locker didn't exist. Carter's curiosity was piqued. He checked the surrounding inventory logs. The locker was in a section designated for overflow from closed burglary cases from the late 80s and early 90s. But its lack of official designation was a breach of every protocol he knew. Following procedure, he flagged it for his supervisor, who, after a brief, uninterested inspection, authorized him to bolt cut the lock and catalog whatever was inside as unmarked legacy property. With a loud crack that echoed in the cavernous room, the old lock snapped. Carter swung open the heavy metal door. The locker was mostly empty, save for a thick layer of dust and one object resting in the center. A single, large, heat-sealed evidence bag. It was the kind used for clothing and larger items. The bag itself was thick with grime, but what struck Carter as immediately wrong was the evidence tag attached to it with a brittle zip tie. It was a standard APD tag from the era, but the fields were filled out with a sloppy, almost illegible scrawl. The case number was a faded, non-standard string of digits that didn't match any known format. The item description field was left ominously blank. The logging officer signature was an indecipherable smear. This wasn't just old, it was wrong. It felt deliberately obscured, intentionally lost within the system. Following protocol for unlogged evidence, Carter donned a pair of latex gloves and carefully carried the bag to a clean examination table under the bright fluorescent lights. The bag was surprisingly heavy. Inside, he could see a bundle of dark, folded fabric and the glint of something metallic. He carefully cut open the heat seal at the top of the bag. The air that escaped was stale, carrying the faint, coppery scent of old blood. He reached in and first pulled out the metallic object. It was a standard-issue police baton from the early 90s, its surface tarnished with age, but otherwise unremarkable. He set aside. Then, he carefully removed the fabric. It was a set of civilian clothes, a pair of denim jeans, a simple t-shirt with a faded band logo, and a pair of high-top sneakers. They were stiff, discolored, and as he unfolded the t-shirt, he saw the unmistakable dark, rust-colored stains splattered across the chest and shoulders. They were bloodstains, and there were a lot of them. The clothes were also torn in places, the rips suggesting a violent struggle. Carter felt a cold knot form in his stomach. A bloody set of a teenager's clothes and an unlogged police baton, hidden together in a secret locker for nearly 30 years. This wasn't just a procedural error. This was a secret someone had tried to bury. He knew he couldn't just log this and move on. He knew his immediate supervisor, a man approaching retirement who hated anything that disrupted the status quo, would likely try to bury it again. He thought about the chain of command, then made a decision. There were whispers in the department, rumors of a new deputy chief, a reformer, someone who was actively looking to dredge up the skeletons of the department's past. Her name was Aisha Williams. Officer Ben Carter bypassed his direct supervisor. He carefully resealed the evidence bag, secured the locker, and made a call directly to the deputy chief's office, requesting an urgent, confidential meeting. He didn't know what case this evidence belonged to or the story behind it. He only knew that he was holding a piece of a dark, violent secret, one that had been deliberately hidden by someone on the inside. And he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that after 29 years, it was time for that secret to see the light. Deputy Chief Aisha Williams was a woman who understood the weight of history. In her early 50s, she had risen through the ranks of the Atlanta Police Department with a reputation for sharp intelligence, unwavering integrity, and a quiet determination to reform the very institution she served. She had seen firsthand how the blue wall of silence could protect predators and perpetuate injustice, and she had made it her mission to bring a new era of accountability to the force. When a young, earnest officer from the Evidence Division named Ben Carter requested a confidential meeting about a gravely irregular discovery, she took it immediately. In the sterile quiet of her office, Carter laid out the story, his voice steady but his hands betraying a nervous energy. He described the unmarked locker, the improperly tagged evidence bag, and its disturbing contents, the bloody clothes of a teenager, and the unlogged police baton from the early 1990s. As he spoke, Williams listened with a focused intensity, her expression unreadable. She recognized the scent of a deep, institutional rot, the kind she was determined to excavate. When Carter finished, she looked at the evidence photos he had discreetly taken. "You did the right thing bringing this directly to me, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This conversation and this evidence does not leave this room. Am I clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Carter said, a wave of relief washing over him. Deputy Chief Williams launched what she knew would be a dangerous and politically fraught investigation, an unofficial, off-the-books inquiry into her own department's past. She brought in a small, trusted team, a forensic analyst from the State Bureau to avoid any potential conflicts of interest within the APD lab, and one of her most trusted cold case detectives. The first step was to identify the clothes. Modern DNA testing, a tool that was science fiction in 1993, made short work of it. A sample of the dried blood was carefully extracted from a t-shirt. Within days, they had a DNA profile. But with no matching profile in any existing criminal database, it was a dead end. Their only hope was familial DNA. They started a painstaking search through missing persons reports from 1993, looking for a black male teenager whose disappearance was unresolved. It took weeks of cross-referencing old, poorly digitized files. But eventually they found him, Dion Campbell, a 17-year-old boy, last seen in the custody of the 4th Precinct, who had allegedly assaulted an officer and escaped, becoming a fugitive. His family had fiercely contested the official story. The lead officer on that case, a name that made Williams's jaw tighten, a recently retired but still influential sergeant named Frank Miller. The pieces began to click into place with horrifying clarity. Williams knew her next step would be fraught with pain, but it was necessary. She reached out to Nia Campbell. Nia, now a formidable public defender of 41, was initially wary when she received the call from the deputy chief's office. She had spent her entire adult life fighting a system she believed had not only failed her brother, but had actively vilified him. She had learned to expect nothing but roadblocks and dismissive sympathy from law enforcement. In a quiet meeting in a neutral location away from the precinct, Deputy Chief Williams laid out the discovery. She showed Nia the photos of the clothes, the baton, and then she told her about the DNA. "We have reason to believe these belong to your brother, Dion," Williams said gently. "And we have reason to believe the official story of his escape was a lie." For Nia, it was a seismic shock, a confirmation of the dark suspicion she had carried for 29 years. The grief was immediate, raw, a sudden reopening of a wound that had never healed. But beneath the grief was a surge of something else, a cold, hard fury, and a flicker of vindication. She wasn't crazy. Her family hadn't been wrong. They had been lied to. An internal war began. Deputy Chief Williams's small team worked in secret, knowing that if word got out, Miller and his old network would have time to coordinate their stories and destroy any remaining evidence. The forensic team analyzed the clothes further. The bloodstain patterns were consistent with a severe, prolonged beating, not the minor scuffle described in the 1993 report of Miller's assault. The tears in the fabric were not consistent with an escape through a fence or over a wall. Nia became an invaluable, if unofficial, partner in the investigation. Her legal mind, honed by years in the courtroom, dissected the original 1993 case file, pointing out inconsistencies, procedural impossibilities, and outright fabrications. She remembered names of officers who were on duty that night, men whose careers had either flourished or quietly ended in the years after. She used her skills as an investigator to track them down, to find cracks in the blue wall of silence. The investigation became a tense thriller, a battle of wits and wills against the ghosts of the department's past. They re-interviewed retired officers from the 4th Precinct, some defensive and hostile, others old, and perhaps more willing to unburden their consciences. They pieced together a timeline of that fateful night, a timeline that starkly contradicted Frank Miller's official report. They learned of Miller's notoriously racist reputation, his history of backroom interrogations. Slowly, carefully, Deputy Chief Williams and Nia Campbell were building a case, not just against a single officer, but against a corrupt system that had allowed a boy to be murdered within its walls, and then had spent nearly 3 decades protecting the killers by assassinating his character. The bloody clothes, hidden away by a killer's arrogance, had become the thread. And now, they were pulling on it, ready to unravel the whole rotten tapestry. The final phase of the investigation into Dion Campbell's disappearance was a slow, deliberate tightening of a net that had been cast in secret. Deputy Chief Aisha Williams knew she had only one shot to bring down a figure as entrenched and protected as the retired Sergeant Frank Miller. The DNA evidence from Dion's clothes was irrefutable proof that he had been brutally beaten, but it didn't definitively name his killer. The key was to break the 29-year-old wall of silence that Miller and his cronies had built. Nia Campbell, working in parallel with Williams's official investigation, became the public face of the fight, a relentless advocate for the brother she had lost. She used her legal expertise and media contacts to begin asking questions, carefully and strategically, about the inconsistencies in the original 1993 case. She spoke of Dion not as a fugitive, but as a boy who loved auto mechanics, a boy who was scared of her mother's temper, but not of standing up for himself. She humanized him, chipping away at the monstrous caricature the department had created. The pressure began to work. One of the other officers who had been in the interrogation room that night in 1993, a man named Henderson who had since retired and moved out of state, plagued by ill health and a guilty conscience, finally agreed to speak to Detective Williams on the condition of immunity. His testimony was the final, crucial piece. He described the interrogation that spiraled out of control, Miller's unhinged rage, the fatal blow with the baton, and the cold, methodical cover-up that followed. He confirmed that Miller himself had hidden the evidence bag in the unlocked locker, arrogantly believing it would never be found. Armed with Henderson's confession and the overwhelming forensic evidence, the department could no longer hide. Frank Miller, now a defiant, unrepentant man in his late 60s, living a comfortable suburban life on his police pension, was arrested and charged with the murder of Dion Campbell. His 2 main accomplices from that night were also charged, one of them Henderson, whose testimony was part of his plea deal. The indictment sent shockwaves through the city and the police department. The story of the fugitive's ghost became a media firestorm, a symbol of a long overdue reckoning with a dark past. Miller, true to form, was belligerent, denying everything, his defense team immediately moving to discredit Henderson as a liar and attacking Nia Campbell as a vengeful woman obsessed with a false narrative. The legal battle was long and arduous. A full murder conviction after so many decades, with a key witness who was also an accomplice and with Dion's body still missing, was incredibly difficult. The prosecution, knowing this, focused on what they could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. The brutal assault, the conspiracy, the cover-up. In the end, justice was partial but profound. Miller was ultimately convicted, not of first-degree murder, but of lesser charges including manslaughter and obstruction of justice, enough to ensure the aging, disgraced officer would spend the rest of his life in prison. The other officer received a similar sentence. The legal outcome was messy, a reflection of the compromised evidence and the passage of time. But for Nia Campbell, the true victory lay outside the courtroom verdict. The trial had forced the entire, sordid truth into the light. Official police records were amended. Dion Campbell's status as a fugitive was expunged. He was officially declared a victim. His death ruled a homicide at the hands of police officers while in their custody. His name was cleared. A memorial service was held for Dion at the family's old church, the same one they had been forced to leave in shame nearly 30 years prior. It was attended by hundreds, a cathartic outpouring of community grief and support. Nia stood at the front, her voice clear and strong, and spoke of her brother. Not of his death, but of his life. Of his love for cars, his infectious laugh, his quiet courage. She spoke of the 29 years of injustice and the hard-won battle to restore his name. Nia is standing before a newly placed memorial plaque in a quiet corner of a local park. It reads, "In loving memory of Dion Campbell, 1976 to 1993. A son, a brother, his truth finally told. His body was never recovered from the secret grave Frank Miller took him to, and that remained a permanent, aching void for Nia. She had not found her brother's final resting place, but she had brought his ghost home. She had won the only battle that truly mattered. She had reclaimed his story, his honor, his name. The silence was broken. Justice was incomplete, as it so often was, but the truth, after 29 long years, had finally, blessedly, been set free.